Well, as I've been reporting this afternoon, Treasurer Jim Chalmers is set to end the run of 15 years without a budget surplus when he hands down the budget on Tuesday night. It will be delivered against the backdrop of inflation that remains stubbornly high and a week after the Reserve Bank lifted interest rates for the 11th time in 12 months. Let's bring in Dr. Pradeep Phillip from Deloitte Access Economics. And first, can I get your reaction to my report this afternoon that the Treasurer will hand down a budget surplus for 22-23 on Tuesday night? Pradeep.
Well, Andrew, our budget monitor, which we released today, shows that there is a large cyclical upswing in revenue. So the Treasury coffers are overflowing with revenue from two main sources. The rest of the world has given us a paycheck, more than we expected. And because we've got record low or near record low unemployment levels, there's a lot of employment and revenue flowing through the domestic economy. So it is possible, we'll have to wait and see for Tuesday night, but there are a lot of good indications that might suggest that the Treasurer could do this. But one thing I do want to say, Andrew, is a surplus or a deficit per se is often used as a political test, but it's not really an economic test of whether you're a good economic manager. The key thing is to get the structural elements of the budget right. And right now, even if there is a surplus announced for 1 year, we know that there's a structural problem in the budget that needs fixing.
Look, it's a very good point, but I will say too, it's pretty significant, isn't it, when it's been 15 years since a federal government's produced one.
Andrew, that is true. And from an economic perspective, the really significant thing is we saw in the last mini budget in October that the government made about $20 billion worth of savings, that they banked more than 90% of the cyclical upswing in revenue. Well, the test for the government going forward in this budget is how much of the cyclical upswing in revenue they bank for the future, and it should be the majority of it, and whether they are continuing the hard work of identifying programs that don't work, that are inefficient, and redirecting them to the bottom line or to other forms of spending. That is what is significant about the current economic circumstances the government finds itself in.
Well, speaking of which, your forecasts expect an additional $80 billion in revenue over the next 4 years, mostly from commodity prices and company tax receipts. That's compared to the October budget. Should the government pay off debt with that extra revenue? What should they do?
Well, I think this is a good test for the government. Will they bank the majority of this to the bottom line and resist the urge to spend too much? Now, one of the things that they announced in October, if you looked at the expenditure profile over the forward estimates, it was pretty flat. But we do know that there are big pressures on the budget. Defence, for example. We're going to have to spend billions more a year to get our defence position right. The NDIS, you've been having conversations about that today. That is what the government is trying to do, is pull back not the NDIS per se, but the rampant growth in the NDIS. So it's still going to grow. Health, aged care, these are all big pressures on the economy. And of course, there's a big economic pressure. How do we lift investment in our economy to get business investing in the new digital technology of the future and to deal with climate change? So the spending pressure is going to be great, and that has to come from good reforms of the budget.
Now, Katie Gallagher spoke to me earlier about the long-term structural issues facing the budget. You've actually put forward 3 policy ideas to reduce the structural deficit over the next decade, and they are raising the GST to 15%, reducing the capital gains tax discount to 33%, and simplifying marginal income tax rates while increasing the tax-free threshold. How do you arrive at that mix? And would you agree with me, you've got Buckleys of that occurring from a political point of view?
Look, we need to have a sensible debate about tax. We've been talking about it for a long time, and we're not doing enough to make sure that our tax system and economic reforms are fit for purpose to drive our economy in the future. Just a couple of weeks ago, Andrew, we released our economic outlook, and what that showed was GDP per capita our standards of living, we're going to go sideways over the next 3 years, not improving. Why? Because we haven't been reforming enough. Now, one of the things in our proposal released today is to make changes to income tax. You know, Andrew, even with stage 3 tax cuts, over the decade, using Treasury's own numbers, we'll be paying more. Average personal income tax rate will be higher. It'll be higher than the GST era. Now, that means individuals are just going to be paying more and more. And the question is, why do we tax good things like income and don't tax bad things like carbon? So we need to shift our tax system towards the things that are more efficient in terms of a tax base, like the GST. We need to close some loopholes, and we also need to deal with areas where we've probably been too generous, where we've overcompensated, like the discount on the CGT.
I've got to say though, Pradeep, the introduction of the GST itself led to about a 1 or 2% rise in inflation, didn't it? So there's that risk if you did it in this environment.
Look, that was a temporary increase, and at the time, the central bank did say they were going to look through the temporary effects of the GST. So I think that is something that is well understood even by our central banks, and I don't think that is an economic problem for us to
neat segue there to the Reserve Bank. You made the observation this week that it was playing recession roulette after its latest rate rise. Is there much else the Reserve Bank can do? Do you think there's a chance of a recession? Philip Lowe is saying high inflation is a scourge, but you seem to indicate the bank should not have raised rates twice this year.
Look, high interest rates are a scourge, and we did see high inflation is a scourge, and we did see inflation peak in the December quarter. Since then, it has started to come down, and even the Reserve Bank says that it's coming down consistent with its central forecast over the next couple of years. Now, we see a couple of things happening. One is that inflation has peaked and starting to come down. Second, we aren't seeing wages grow at the rates that people have been worried about. And third, we already know that the economy has been slowing. And so we think that given that the economy has been slowing so much, and the previous interest rates, prior to this week, there were 10 interest rates already baked into the system, the effect of which we haven't seen on the economy yet, and yet the economy is already slowing. So this was why, respectfully, we had a view that this week the Reserve Bank should have paused.
There you go. Pradeep, Philip from Deloitte Economics, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.